In the winter of 2021, a hand-woven rug made from 16 years of factory rejects sold for $31,800 in a design showroom on West 20th Street in Manhattan. It was 14 feet wide and 20 feet long. It weighed a little over 200 pounds. The label on the wall called it Ashline Orphan No. 19, and its surface looked almost geological. Bands of peat brown, storm gray, bruised violet, and one narrow line of copper running through the middle like light under a closed door. No one could order another one like it, not because the weaver refused, because the material no longer existed. Every inch of that rug had come from yarn the Briar Falls Woolworks had written off as failure, dye lots that came out uneven, merino that spun too thick in one section and too thin in the next, cashmere blends with the wrong hand, experimental batches that missed the buyer's color card by a shade so slight a customer might never notice it. But a mill inspector would. On the mill's books, all of it had a value of 0, but the story of that rug does not begin in Manhattan. It begins behind a dye house in western Pennsylvania, beside a low concrete drainage wall where steam from the wool vats used to drift across the gravel on cold mornings. That wall was not built to be beautiful. It was a gray, poured concrete barrier, 4 feet high, stained with rust where old pipe brackets had bled into the surface. On one side was the back lot of Briar Falls Woolworks, a century-old brick mill that smelled of wet wool, dye liquor, machine oil, and rain. On the other side was the Calder place, 31 acres of rough pasture, 2 falling apple trees, a white farmhouse with a slate roof, and a timber barn that held the oldest working object in 3 counties. A 14-foot barn loom. The wall's purpose was simple. It separated the world that measured wool by invoices from the world that measured wool by touch. Mara Calder was 61 years old when the first reject pile appeared in the spring of 2005. She had lived on the Calder place since the day she was born, except for a 5-year stretch after her husband died, when she had taken finishing work at the mill and learned the inside language of industrial fabric. Tensile strength, shade variance, twist count, fulling loss. But long before the mill taught her its vocabulary, the barn had taught her another one. Warp, weft, shuttle, treadle, beat. The loom in Mara's barn had been built in 1906 by her grandmother's brother, a wagon maker who understood that a loom big enough for rugs had to behave like a bridge. The frame was black walnut, darkened by oil and time. The beams were thick enough that 2 grown men could sit on them without hearing a creak. The iron ratchets had been forged in town, back when the town still had a forge, and they locked the warp beam with a sound like a gate being closed on a vault. Mara's grandmother had used that loom to make coverlets, runners, stable blankets, and once during the hard winter of 1936, rugs cut from old coats and feed sacks. She taught Mara the rule before she taught her the pattern. A loom does not make pretty things. A loom makes stubborn things hold together. Mara believed that more than most people believe church doctrine. It was the sentence that had carried her through drought, widowhood, bad hips, thin years, and the slow death of every small industry around Briar Falls. So when the first reject pile appeared beside the drainage wall, Mara noticed it in a way other people did not. It was a Thursday. A forklift came out of the dye house doors, its forks carrying 3 crushed cardboard gaylords full of hanks. The driver tilted the load. The yarn slid onto the gravel in a dull, soft collapse. Most of it was a dark green, almost spruce, but streaked through with pale yellow where the dye had failed to strike evenly. The driver did not even look at it once it hit the ground. To him, it was a disposal problem. To the mill, it was spoilage. To Mara, standing in the open door of her barn with a cup of coffee cooling in her hand, it was wool. For 2 weeks she did nothing. Then the next Thursday came, and with it another pile. This one was blue-gray, but with sections that had gone nearly silver. The week after that, a muddy rose. Then black yarn with russet blooms in it like heat marks on iron. Then cream yarn speckled with tiny flecks of red dye from a contaminated vat. By summer, the pile ran 30 feet along the wall. People in town noticed. They called it the dye house dump. They said Briar Falls was getting sloppy. They said someone should make the mill clean it up. They said it was ugly. Mara did not disagree that it was ugly. She simply knew ugliness was not the same as uselessness. The mill had trained people to see one mistake at a time: a failed lot, a bad batch, a contaminated run, a loss entry. Mara saw the pile the way a farmer sees a weathered field in March, not as what it looked like now, but as what it might become if someone was willing to do the work. In October, after the first frost, she took a wheelbarrow down to the wall. She did not go onto mill property. That mattered to her. She used an old hay hook to pull loose hanks over the concrete, one armload at a time. The wool was damp in places, dusty in others, and so tangled that anyone in a hurry would have given up inside 10 minutes. Mara was not in a hurry. She carried the first load back to the barn, laid it on a canvas drop cloth, and began separating it by hand. She sorted by fiber first, then by weight, by color family, then by the kind of mistake: uneven dye, weak spin, wrong shade, broken ply, color contamination, experimental blend. She made tags from brown paper and string. She wrote the month when she could guess it, the defect when she could feel it, and the mood of the color when no official name would do. Winter River, Burnt Oat, Storm Lilac, Copper Bruise. A bookkeeper would have laughed at those names. The mill used lot numbers, but Mara was not building a spreadsheet. She was building a memory system. By the time snow came, she had filled one shed. By the next summer, she had filled two. She did not know whether she was collecting material for a project or simply rescuing something that offended her to see abandoned. Sometimes those are the same thing. For 3 years, the piles kept coming every Thursday afternoon, a forklift. Every Thursday evening, if the weather held, Mara and her wheelbarrow. She did not ask permission. No one stopped her. The old plant manager knew and considered it one less thing to pay for. Then in 2008, a new operations director arrived. His name was Graham Vale, and he had the polished exhaustion of a man who believed every human problem was hiding an efficiency problem underneath. He had worked in packaging, then automotive parts, then synthetic textiles. He carried a tablet before most people in Briar Falls owned one, and he spoke in numbers that seemed designed to end conversations rather than begin them. Throughput, shrink, variance, liability exposure, waste stream. On his second week, Graham asked why several tons of unusable yarn were sitting behind the dye house. The maintenance supervisor told him about Tess Calder. Graham did not like the answer. It was not that he cared about the yarn. He cared that there was no form for what was happening. No signed agreement, no documented release, no approved disposal path. In Graham's world, an informal arrangement was not neighborliness. It was a leak in the system. So he walked across the access road one morning and found Mara in the barn, standing at the big loom, tightening a row of warp threads. The barn was cold. Dust floated in a shaft of light from the hayloft. The loom rose behind Mara like the ribcage of some enormous sleeping animal. Graham introduced himself. He wore black dress shoes that sank slightly into the packed dirt floor. "Mrs. Calder," he said, "I'm here to regularize the fiber disposal arrangement." Mara kept her hand on the warp. "Are you?" Graham opened a folder. He explained that the material deposited along the drainage wall had no resale value. He explained that removal through a certified recycler would cost the company roughly $9,000 a year. He explained that, by allowing her to remove it voluntarily, the mill had saved a meaningful sum. Then he used the phrase he had come to use: "Book value is zero." Mara looked at the folder. Then she looked at the yarn stacked in her shed. Then she looked at the loom. "What your book is missing," she said, "is a column for patience." Graham smiled, the careful smile of a man who had decided not to argue with a local eccentric. "From an accounting standpoint," he said, "patience is not an asset class." "No," Mara said. "That is why your books keep surprising you." She did not sign the paper. The dumping continued anyway. For Graham, it became a tidy line in his reports: reduced disposal cost, no charge. For Mara, it became Thursday's harvest. That same winter, Mara warped the full width of the loom for the first time since her grandmother's funeral. It took her 9 days. The warp was heavy linen, strong enough to survive being pulled tight across 14 feet of frame. She threaded thousands of ends through heddles by lamplight, stopping every hour to stretch her hands. It was the kind of work that looked repetitive to anyone who had never done it. But one mistake in the threading could disturb the entire cloth. On the 10th day, she sat on the bench, set her feet on the treadles, and began. She did not follow a printed pattern. A printed pattern assumes obedient material. This yarn was not obedient. It swelled and thinned. It flashed with colors that did not belong together until they did. A soft gray would suddenly reveal a vein of lavender. A brown would turn red under the barn light. A cream hank would carry a few inches of blue contamination like a mistake remembering where it had been. Mara let the yarn speak first. She chose one hank, wound it onto a shuttle, opened the shed with her foot, and threw the shuttle across the loom. Throw, catch, beat. The beater came forward with a low wooden thud, pressing the weft into place. Throw, catch, beat. The rug grew slowly. Some days less than 4 inches. Some days not at all if the yarn fought her or her hip ached too badly. But the surface that emerged was unlike anything she had woven before. It was not symmetrical. It was not polite. It looked less designed than discovered. The first rug took nearly 5 months. When Mara cut it from the loom, it rolled onto the barn floor like a section of earth. It was too large for her house, too strange for a church raffle, and too valuable in labor for the craft fair down by the fire hall. So she wrapped it in muslin and stored it in the hayloft. Then she began another. Years passed. The mill struggled through the changes that were reshaping every textile town. Buyers demanded shorter runs, lower prices, cleaner uniformity. Overseas yarn came in cheaper. Energy costs rose. The old machines required parts that had to be custom-made because the companies that built them no longer existed. Briar Falls survived by making smaller runs for luxury clients, which meant the mistakes became more frequent and more interesting. A perfect mill tries to eliminate variation. A desperate mill produces it by accident. By 2015, Mara had woven 37 large rugs and dozens of smaller pieces. She had no brand, no business plan, no route to buyers. She knew exactly how much blue-gray cashmere was in Shed 2 and almost nothing about what the rugs might be worth. That was the year her granddaughter, Tess, came home for the summer. Tess Calder was 23, sharp, restless, and allergic to every sentence in town that began with, "Around here, we don't." She had left for Philadelphia to study design management, partly because she loved objects and partly because she did not want to become one of the women in Briar Falls who spent their lives adapting to whatever the mills decided to take away. As a child, Tess had loved the yarn sheds. She had slept inside forts made of wool sacks and used flawed merino as hair for scarecrows. As a teenager, she had hated them. They smelled dusty, they made the property look poor. Her friends called it the Calder wool dump. At college, a professor used a phrase that turned the whole memory in her mind: Deadstock. The professor showed slides of luxury brands buying leftover fabric from closed factories. He talked about circular design, provenance, scarcity, material story. He said the market had changed. People no longer paid only for polish. They paid for proof. Tess sat there thinking about the sheds behind her grandmother's barn. Proof was exactly what they had. That weekend she came home and climbed to the hayloft. Mara had unrolled one rug halfway to inspect a repair. Sunlight from the barn boards fell across the surface in thin bars. Tess stood at the edge of it and saw for the first time not a family oddity, but an inventory of American mistakes made beautiful. "How many are there?" Tess asked. Mara shrugged. "Enough. Enough is not a number. It is if you are the one weaving." Tess spent the next month counting anyway. She photographed every finished rug against the side of the barn. She built a database from Mara's paper tags. She weighed bags of yarn, cataloged fiber content, and assigned names to the orphan lots. She created a website called Calder Ashline, named for the gray streak that ran along the drainage wall where the dye house steam had darkened the concrete. Mara disliked the name at first. "It sounds like something burned down," she said. Tess looked at the sheds, the mill, the wall, the yarn that had been declared worthless for a decade. "Something did," she said. "We're using what survived." The first piece Tess listed online was not one of the giants. It was a 3x5 rug woven from cream wool contaminated with blue and copper. She priced it at $650 and felt almost criminal for doing it. It sold in 47 minutes. The buyer was an interior designer in Brooklyn. The email arrived the next morning. "This does not look manufactured. It looks remembered. Do you take commissions?" Tess printed the email and brought it to the barn. Mara read it twice, expressionless. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into the drawer where she kept shuttle wax and spare heddles. The first commission was for a restaurant in Pittsburgh, 8 by 12 feet, $12,000. Tess negotiated the contract while walking circles around the farmhouse kitchen because she could not sit still. Mara listened, nodded once, and asked what colors they needed. The second commission went to a hotel in Savannah, the third to a private library in Boston. By 2018, Calder Ashline had a wait list. By 2019, Tess had hired 2 part-time helpers, both retired millwomen who knew how to wash, wind, and repair damaged skeins without breaking them. By 2020, the yarn sheds had become less like storage and more like a strange rural archive. 76,200 pounds of usable wool and blended fiber, 1,408 identified orphan lots, 227 finished rugs of various sizes, a 3-year commission queue. The numbers mattered because Graham Vail understood numbers, and eventually, Graham came back for the yarn. Briar Falls Woolworks closed in February of 2021 after 104 years of operation. The announcement arrived on a Monday, printed on company letterhead and taped inside the mill entrance before the morning shift. 86 workers were told the finishing department would shut down first, then spinning, then dye, then shipping. The owners blamed costs, supply chain instability, and a market that wanted heritage quality at commodity prices. For a week, the town sounded wrong. A mill town does not know how loud its mill is until the machines stop. Without the low vibration of carders and winders, Briar Falls felt hollow, as if someone had removed the bass note from the air. Graham stayed to manage the closure. Asset disposition, he called it. Site environmental review, inventory reconciliation. Then he saw the line item that had followed him for 13 years. Reject fiber, off-spec yarn, informal removal. He drove to the Calder place on a wet March afternoon and found Mara and Tess in Shed 3. Tess was scanning tags with her phone. Mara was running a handful of plum-colored merino through her fingers, feeling for breaks. Graham looked older than he had in the barn years before. The clean certainty had thinned out of him. But when he spoke, the old language returned. Corporate wants the back lot cleared, he said. Everything along the drainage wall has to be removed before the property transfer. Tess stopped scanning. Graham continued. Some of the material migrated onto your side over the years. The company is willing to cover removal as a courtesy. Loader trucks, labor disposal. You won't be charged. He meant it kindly. That was the problem. He still believed cleanup was a gift. Mara looked at the shed around her, the tagged bags, the repaired skeins. The crates of color no machine would ever repeat. Then she looked at Graham. What your book is missing, she said, is still the same column. Graham's face tightened. Mara, with respect, this is not a philosophical issue. We generated the material. It failed spec. We carried the disposal cost. It has a recorded value of 0. Tess stepped between them, not aggressively, but with the calm of someone who had been waiting years for the right spreadsheet to meet the wrong one. Mr. Vail, she said, our current inventory is 76,200 pounds of sorted fiber. We have 1,408 active orphan lots, each tagged by defect, approximate year, fiber type, and color behavior. My grandmother has woven 227 rugs from this material. Our lowest recorded sale was $650. Our highest private commission was $24,000. Graham stared at her. Tess turned the tablet so he could see the dashboard. We have 64 clients waiting. Projected order value is $1.8 million before licensing or retail placement. Last month, Artisan House in Manhattan selected 6 large ashline rugs for their spring installation at a wholesale value of $99,000. They are not buying despite the flaws, they are buying because of them. The rain ticked on the tin roof. For a long moment, Graham did not speak. He looked at the bags of yarn. He had seen them for years as leakage, liability, housekeeping. He had put them in reports. He had reduced them to disposal savings. He had called them 0 because his system had no field for a grandmother's patience, a granddaughter's timing, or a loom old enough to understand irregular material. The loader did not come the next day. The trucks did not come that week. Graham called corporate and used words they understood. Pending claim, inventory dispute, potential value recovery, public relations risk. But privately, before he left, he stood at the barn door and watched Mara weave for almost 10 minutes. Throw, catch, beat. The sound filled the space with a steadiness the mill no longer had. After Briar Falls closed, Calder Ash Line changed. Not quickly, not loudly. The company did not become a miracle overnight. It became something rarer than that. It became useful. Tess leased the old mill's sample room and turned it into a finishing studio. She hired 4 former Briar Falls workers before the year ended. A dyer who could read color shift in wet fiber, a spinner who could strengthen weak yarn without killing its softness, a carder who understood blend by smell and touch, and a finisher whose hands could find a loose thread faster than most people could find a typo. They did not come to rescue nostalgia. They came because they still knew things. The mill had closed. But the knowledge inside the workers had not. That was the part Graham's reports had never captured. A factory is not only a building full of machines, it is a concentration of human memory. How long to soak wool before it gives up the dirt but not the lanolin? How much tension a damaged ply can take before it snaps? Which blues go dead under warm light? Which browns need gray beside them to look alive? Mara had saved the material, Tess saved the proof. The former mill workers saved the methods that let the material keep becoming something. When Ashline Orphan number 19 sold in Manhattan, the showroom displayed a small card beside it. The card listed the components: failed storm gray merino from 2009, a plum cashmere blend rejected for streaking in 2012, peat brown wool spun heavy in 2016, and a copper experimental lot from the final year of the dye house. A buyer asked Tess whether the copper streak could be made wider on the next one. Tess said no, that was not a limitation, it was the point. The copper existed because one vat, 1 year, under one set of mistakes, produced something the mill could not use and the loom could not forget. Every Ashline rug now carries a tag on the back with its orphan lots, defect types, and approximate year of rejection. Customers read those tags the way other people read provenance on paintings. The flaws are no longer hidden in the underside of the story. They are the signature. Mara is 78 now. She still weaves most mornings. Her hip is worse. Her hands are slower. Tess has added 2 apprentice weavers, though Mara insists that anyone who touches the big loom must first spend 6 months sorting yarn by hand. Not because sorting is efficient, it is not. Because you cannot weave value from material you have not learned to respect. The old mill building is mostly quiet. The dye house stacks no longer steam. Weeds grow in the cracks behind the loading dock. The drainage wall is still there, gray and rust-stained, but the space beside it is clean now. No more Thursday piles, no more forklift, no more soft collapse of rejected color onto gravel. Inside the former sample room, finished rugs are rolled, tagged, photographed, and shipped to houses and hotels that will never smell wet wool or hear the beat of the loom that made them. Then, several times a week, Tess drives a finished rug back through the old mill gate, into the building that once declared its material worthless. No one in Briar Falls misses the irony. The mill wanted yarn to be perfect enough to disappear into uniform product. Mara wanted yarn honest enough to reveal where it had been. That difference changed everything. A rigid system sees a flaw as the end of a process. A patient maker sees a flaw as information. The mill's mistake was not that it produced imperfect yarn. Every system produces waste. The mistake was believing that its own definition of waste was final. It was not final, it was only local. It was true inside the mill's accounting software, inside its quality control sheets, inside the narrow promise it had made to buyers who wanted sameness. But outside that promise, on the other side of a drainage wall, the same material was still warm with labor, color, time, and possibility. The ledger called it zero because the ledger was built to measure the wrong thing. Mara's loom measured differently. It measured patience in inches, memory in knots, failure in color. It took what the mill could not standardize and made it strong enough to walk on. That is why the story stays with people. Not because an old woman outsmarted a company. Not because ugly yarn became expensive rugs. Those are only the visible parts. The deeper truth is simpler and more dangerous. Some value does not appear until the person looking at it changes. Graham Vale had data. He was not stupid. The mill had machines. They were not useless. The system had logic. It was not imaginary. It was incomplete. Mara Calder had no department, no title, no quarterly target, and no permission slip. What she had was the discipline to keep looking after everyone else had named the thing and moved on. For 16 years she pulled color over a wall. She sorted it, tagged it, washed it, wove it. She added the column the ledger was missing. The mill is closed now. Its books are settled. Its machines are gone. But in the Calder barn the walnut loom still moves. Throw, catch, beat. The sound is slow, stubborn, and alive. The ledger is closed. The loom is still writing.